Okay, this is the start of your second term of ninth class, ninth chemistry, and we'll start this by the types of bonding. The first bonding that we'll study in this chapter is the ionic bonding. Alright, so before we get into the guts of this topic, we need to have a little background of what was noble gas configuration. Alright, now we know that noble gases have their duplet or their octet complete, alright, which means that their valence electrons or their valence shells are full of electrons. Valence shells are full of electrons. That means the maximum capacity has been reached. Alright, for example, helium has one shell only, and one shell has the maximum capacity of 2 electrons, and helium has all the electrons that it can that it can add into its valence shell. Similarly, neon has an electronic configuration of 2 8. It has two electronic shells, and the second shell has a maximum capacity of 8 electrons, and helium has 8 electrons in its valence shell, which means that its octet is complete and duplet of helium is complete. Alright, so this is the dream configuration of all the other elements as well. All elements want their valence shell to be full. All elements want their valence shell to be complete. Alright, all elements want to have either duplet or octet electronic configuration. Alright, so how that is the reason they bond. Alright, that is the reason they do different bonding, different reactions. Alright, so as they can complete their valence electrons, they can achieve their dream, they can fulfill or they can suffice their valence electrons. So how do atoms achieve this noble gas configuration? That is by one of these three methods. Number one is by losing electrons. Number two is by gaining electrons or by sharing electrons. We'll study number one and two, which is gaining or losing electrons. In other words, we call it electron transfer. When an atom either gains or loses an electron from its valence shell. Alright, this electron transfer or the gain or loss of electron, this results in ionic bonding. That is what we're going to study in this chapter. Sharing electrons results in covalent bonding, which is our next chapter. We'll study this when we reach there. Alright, for now we're concerned with losing electrons or gaining electrons. In short, we're concerned with electron transfer. Let's see what happens. When an atom gains electrons, obviously because the electron has a negative charge, it has to become negative ion. Alright, when an atom gains or loses electrons, they form ions. Now this depends that either the electron is gained or lost, that these atoms will form negative ions or these positive ions. If electrons are being gained by an atom, then an atom forms negative ions because the number of electrons will be more than the number of protons, because initially in an atom the number of protons always equals the number of electrons. Alright, but when this is disturbed, when an electron either leaves a shell or it enters an atom, now the charges are disturbed. Now number of protons is no more equal than to the number of electrons. When electrons are gained, the number of electrons will be more than the number of protons. Alright, because protons are not leaving the atom. Protons or neutrons, they do not leave an atom. They do not leave the nucleus. Only electrons are mobile. Only electron transfer takes place. Only electrons are involved in a chemical reaction, involved in a chemical reaction. No other species, no proton, no neutrons, they take part in a chemical reaction. Only electrons are responsible for that. That is why only electrons either enter an atom or they leave an atom. Alright, number of protons, it remains the same in a nucleus. So when electrons are added, number of negative charges is increased. That is why electrons are more than the protons. So overall negative charge increases. And on the other side, if an atom loses electrons, then because the number of protons is not changing, number of protons is the same, so the number of protons will now be more than the number of electrons. Alright, because electrons are now less, electrons are leaving an atom, so number of electrons will be decreased, which means that number of protons will now be more than the number of electrons. Alright, now depending upon this charge, depending upon this negative or positive charge, we give ions different names. Alright, we call negative ions the anions and we call the positive ions the cations. Why do we say that? That is because the anions, they move towards a node. What is anode? Anode is the positive terminal of the battery. The anions move towards a node during electrolysis. Alright, and the cations, they move towards cathode. Cathode is the negative terminal during electrolysis. Alright, so anode is the positive terminal, which means that it should attract the negative ions. Alright, it makes sense that opposites attract. Negative ions, they must move towards the positive terminal of the battery. That is why anode, it attracts the anions. Alright, and cathode, which is the negative terminal, it should attract the positive ions, and cathode, so it attracts the cations. Alright, you must remember the name of ion with the electrode that it moves towards. Alright, anions move towards anode, cations move towards the cathode. Okay, let's move on. Atoms, compounds, molecules, elements, they're all always neutral. The number of protons always equal the number of electrons in them. But when electrons are either gained or lost, the number of protons and electrons is no more equal. They become ions. Alright, ions are charged particles. Ions are particles in which number of protons is not equal to the number of electrons. That is why they have a charge. Alright, alright. Before an ion is formed, atoms are electrically neutral. Makes sense because number of protons is equal to the number of electrons. So that is why the positive charges equal the negative charges in an atom. Alright, neutrons are neutral; they do not affect the charge. So number of positive charges are equal to the number of negative charges, which means the number of protons equal the number of electrons. Then that means that overall atom has to be neutral. Alright, but when an electron is gained or lost, then an atom becomes an ion. Alright, and atoms become charged. This is the definition of ion that you must know. An ion is a charged particle formed when an atom or a group of atoms, it loses or gains an electron. What is the group of atoms? Group of atom means that, for example, carbonate. Carbonate, it has 4 atoms, 3 oxygen atoms and 1 carbon atoms. And now these group of atoms have gained 2 electrons, which means that now it is an ion. Alright, a negative ion. A negative ion, it must move towards the positive terminal. Alright, so that is why positive terminal is anode. That is why this will be an anion. And sulfate ion is another group of atom, SO4 2 negative. Now this is a group of atom that has gained 2 electrons. Now this is also another anion. which will move towards a node, the positive terminal. And when atoms lose or gain electrons, they become, let's say, Na positive. Now this is a sodium ion, and it was a sodium atom which has lost one electron. That is why it has become Na positive. Alright, and Mg, magnesium atom, when it loses two electrons, it becomes a magnesium 2 positive ion. Alright, here are a few examples of metallic and non-metallic ions. If you notice, then metals, sodium, magnesium, aluminum, they all form positive ions. Alright, and the non-metals, chlorine, oxygen, and sulfur, they all form negative ions. Now this is because metals are usually electron donors. They are usually on the left hand side of the periodic table. They have one or two or three in this case electrons in their valence shell. It is easier for them to lose their electrons and attain the noble gas configuration. Alright, and they become the stable ions then. For example, sodium, it forms a sodium ion when it when it loses one electron. It becomes Na positive. Magnesium become magnesium ion when it loses two electrons. Aluminum becomes aluminum ion when it loses three electrons. Similarly, chlorine becomes chloride ions when it gains one electron. Now these are the non-metals. These are electron acceptors. Oxygen becomes the oxide ion when it gains two electrons, and sulfur becomes sulfide ion when it gains two electrons. Alright, these are usually metals are electron donors. They donate electrons and become positive ions, and non-metals are usually electron acceptors. They accept electrons and they become negative ions. Alright, that's it for now. I'll see you in the next video.